Hi guys, it's John again from Android Addicts, and today we're doing another benchmark test for the Galaxy S22 Ultra. So as I released my previous video, they did release a new firmware update for March, which does allow you to properly disable the game optimization service. So I have now gone back into package disabler and I have enabled and re-disabled the game optimizing service, and we are now going to rerun the benchmarks again to see if it makes any difference at all. Now, it probably won't make a huge amount of difference, so I'm not expecting too much here between the two, but we'll see whether there are any noticeable ones at all. So you can see here the versions that we are currently running on both phones. Again, we've got everything running at the exact same brightness, so really there shouldn't be a huge amount of difference here. I have got the floating temperature widget here at the top. You can download this from the Play Store. It's called Thermal Monitor. It's just a free widget. But I'm going to pop this down here. We're going to start off the test, and we'll just skip through, obviously, the whole thing, and then we'll come to the spreadsheet at the end and see how they both get on. Okay then, so let's take a look at the spreadsheet, and we've got a new section here in blue. So the blue results are from the new GOS update, just to try and keep things simple. And I have then also done a little section to show the increase or decrease in performance on the average of each test. So sadly, as much as I'd like to say there's been a huge change here, there hasn't really been. So let's start off with the Geekbench CPU results. We can see that the Snapdragon is still winning in the single core here with 1196, and the Exynos is still winning in the multi-core with 3455. So they have both had a small increase. The Exynos has had an increase of 2.76% compared to the last update, and the Snapdragon has a much bigger one here, 7.46%, so that's nice to see. We then move on to the Geekbench compute scores here, and again the Exynos is still dominating the Snapdragon in this department. As it was with the 2100, the 2200 is scoring more than 2000 higher in almost every test here compared to the Snapdragon. Interestingly, test 3 there, 8693, is even higher than all the other tests that it did, so even at a warm state, the performance of the compute of the 2200 is definitely very good still. So we can see here with an average score of 8308 for the Exynos, that does again win the Geekbench compute score here with a small increase of 2.61% compared to the previous firmware. So moving on to the Antutu benchmark results here, and amazingly the Exynos is still winning here. I really wasn't expecting this, but you can see there it scored over 913,000 for its first result, and it did steadily go down to about 867,000 or 863 in the final. But the Snapdragon was more consistent, starting at 886, going down slightly to 864, and then starting to really slow down a bit here at 841,000. Still, not really a massive difference compared to the previous firmware. We've actually seen a small decrease in the score results here. So I'm going to just say that the Antutu benchmark hasn't really been affected here. But the Exynos is still winning against the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, which is still quite surprising to me. So next up, we moved on to the Wildlife Extreme test, and as we can see, the Snapdragon is still winning by a fair margin here. So Exynos seemed to start okay in test 1, but then did go down a bit in test 2, picked back up a bit in test 3, but the Snapdragon was consistently better, except for in test 3, where it fell down a bit, but its overall rating, thanks to that test 1, is still better on average than the Exynos. So again, not really a massive increase or decrease here. The Snapdragon actually lost over 3%, but it still managed to beat the Exynos in the Wildlife Extreme test. So next up, we moved on to the Slingshot Extreme. So again, no change in the winners for these tests. The Snapdragon is still winning the graphics tests with 67.6 and 37.7 frames per second. And the Exynos is still winning on the physics tests here. Part 1, 2 and 3, 75.97, 43.27 and 24.40. So a small increase of 1.7 for the Exynos and a larger increase of 3.4 for the Snapdragon. But let's move on to the stress test results now, and we'll look at those in full screen as it's a bit easier to see how the performance was. Okay then, so let's take a look at the stress test results. So we'll start off with the Exynos 2200, and here at the bottom we've got the previous March update results here, and at the top we have the new update that came out the other day. So let's look at the first test, and we can see certainly straight away that the performance of the CPU is much better around here compared to the sort of throttling bits we saw around here towards the second half of the test previously, where it was hiding just under the 60% mark. We can see also the cores are looking much better now, so rather than being flatlining at around 1.5, 1.6 gigahertz here, again towards the second half of the test, we've now got a sort of consistent around 2 gigahertz mark. You can see it does start off a bit higher up and it does then slowly clock down a bit, but overall I would say in test 1 that's a much better result. So test 2 as well, we have got a similar idea here. So we had these very strange dips and peaks in the cores themselves, whereas now they are, like the first test, very similar, just hovering around the 2 gigahertz mark, with the CPU performance as well getting much closer and hovering around 80% more often, 70 to 80, dipping down to 60 a couple of times and just below here towards the end of the test, but overall again a much better result. Now the third result here, again, this was a really strange one where we had 80% for most of the test and then it went higher towards the end of the test, as can be seen in the cores here. They seem to unlock themselves and go a bit crazy. But here, again, we've got a more consistent approach here. We did start off locked down to 1.5, probably because of the heat, but it did then decide to carry on anyway at around the 2 gigahertz mark, just a tiny bit below compared to the second test, I'd say. As you can see, more peaks to around, or troughs to around 1.9 gigahertz here. But the CPU performance though, still sticking around 70 to 80% for most of the test, just a couple of dips down below 60. So overall, although the performance looks a bit worse, it's probably a better performing test overall because of the fact that the cores are running faster and the performance is still around the same. Okay, so let's now take a look at the Snapdragon results here. So again, we've got the March update here and the new GOS update at the top. And we can see here, compared to last time where we were hovering around 60 to 65 around the mid section of the test, we are now a bit higher than that. I'd say more close to 75, getting closer to 80% here. But overall, it's not a huge difference, I'd say, compared to the previous update. In fact, it maybe even starts a little bit worse there. Now the cores and clock speed here look pretty identical almost, to be fair, so a bit of a dip down here, but nothing really too different there. Move on to the second test as well. We've got very similar results here, so you can see the cores look almost identical. There's a bit of a change here at the end, but not a huge amount. They are sticking as high as they can. That's good 2.5, 2.6 gigahertz peaking there for most of the tests. That's really nice to see, same as test 1 as well. And the CPU performance, again, around 60 to 80%, just dipping up and down, peaking to 100 here, but obviously to around 90 up here as well, so that's quite good. But overall, really nice performance there. And the third test as well, we can see here we do get a tiny bit more clocking here downwards to the 1.4 gigahertz mark probably, whereas at the previous tests it was managing to cope up until the previous half, and here it was coping all the way. But on the final test, it does finally step down a bit to keep things cooler. We can see the same happened in last month's update as well, but the CPU performance though is still performing really well here, and in fact this is probably the best performance out of all the tests. You can see here nothing below 60 apart from the very start, so we're not counting that. But yeah, at least 65 to 80 to 90 to 100% for the majority of the test itself. So that is the end of the test. Let me know what your thoughts are down below. Don't forget to keep an eye on the battery usage here. We can see that the test finished with 46% remaining on the Exynos and 42% on the Snapdragon. Now I'm going to do a battery drain test for both of these phones, so be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to be notified when that comes out. But yeah, I have noticed that the Snapdragon does appear to run a tiny bit hotter and therefore drain a bit more battery than the Exynos. I've actually been using the Exynos for a while now and have never managed to run it down in a full day's use of heavy usage, that is, with about 6.5 hours screen on time. So I've been really impressed so far, but hopefully the Snapdragon can get some more updates as well, keep it a bit cooler maybe, and we'll just see once the games have been optimized for these devices. We'll do some tests and see how they're both performing. At the moment, no games are optimized fully for either phone, so it's a bit hard to test really when there's no optimization being done. It'd be like you running a 3D Mark benchmark on your PC with some generic drivers installed. It's not really worth doing just at the moment until we get some better support for these two new chipsets. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, Do like and subscribe. Don't forget to leave your scores down below as well, because it's always interesting to see what other people are getting. I know there can be variations depending on the chip in your phone, so it is interesting to see what other people manage to get. But anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.